Already. First day. Have a good lunch? To the Puerto Rican chicken place, it took too long. They're slow. It's delicious, but slow. Okay, so let's pick back up where we left off before lunch. This discussion in chapter 2 of is something a fixture or is it real property? Is it personal property or is it real property? I've given you the definition here of what severance and annexation. These are just the terms that they use for converting real property into personal property or vice versa. To convert personal property into real property, that's called annexation. You annex, you attach something. Nailed, screwed, or glued. Take something that's personal property, like this board was personal property at one point, right? And then what happened with it? Screwed to the wall. Became what? Real property. That's called annexation. Severance is the opposite. Severance is taking something that's real property, severing it so that it's now what? Personal property. Good. Good. So, how do we determine if something is a fixture? Now, your book gives you this test called IRMA. For my purposes, and for your purposes on the exam, I think that's way too complex. I actually break this down into 2 steps. If you're going to determine on a test if something is a fixture, which you're going to have to do, this is something you're going to see on the exam, do you know if something's a fixture or not? And then you're going to have to tie that with the idea of what happens to it because it's a fixture or because it's not a fixture. What did we say about fixtures? Are they part of the transaction or are they not part of the transaction? They are. Fixtures are part of the transaction. So, when we're determining if something is a fixture, what we're really determining is it part of the sale? Does that make sense for everybody? So, is it a fixture? I want you to ask yourself 2 questions. Number 1, is this thing that we're talking about permanently attached? And what 3 things did I say you could use for permanently attached? Nailed, screwed, or glued. Is it one of those 3 things? If the answer is yes, then it might be a fixture. If the answer is no, what is it? Personal property. You can stop right there. But if the answer is yes, it might be a fixture, but you've still got to go to the second question. Is everybody with me so far? The second question is, who attached it? Was it attached by the owner of the property, or was it attached by a tenant? For it to be a fixture, who do you think had to attach it? The owner of the real estate. And this was getting back to your question earlier. This is why I said, can you hold on to that for just a second, right? So, when it's attached by a tenant, we generally do not consider it real property. We consider it the personal property of who? The tenant. What that means is that the tenant has the right to remove it from the property, as long as they do it before when? Before their lease terminates, and as long as they put the property back in its original condition. Does that make sense for everybody? So generally speaking, if it's installed by a tenant, it's not going to be real property. It's not going to be a fixture. It's going to be personal property of the tenant. So that's why when you're determining if something's a fixture on a test, I want you to read through it. It's going to be a big long paragraph, half a page. Tell you a story. Give you way more information than you probably need. After you read all that information, I want you to ask yourself 2 questions. Number 1, is it nailed, screwed, or glued? Right? Is it permanently attached? If that's a yes, then you go to question number 2. Remember, if that's a no, you can stop right there. Because if it's not nailed, screwed, or glued, it's definitely personal property. Make sense? If it's nailed, screwed, or glued, then we go to question number 2. Was it attached by the owner of the property? If that's also a yes, then the thing is what? You get 2 yeses. Yes, it's attached, and yes, it was attached by the owner of the property. It is real property or a fixture. Everybody good with that? If either one of those questions comes up with a no, what is it? personal property. Okay, can you apply that test? Okay, now let's again tie it back to the bigger idea. Real property, is it part of the transaction? Is real property part of the transaction? Yes. Is personal property part of the transaction? No. Can you change those two things? Yes. But you would do that by what? Annexation or severance. Annexation or severance. But as far as making them part of the transaction, what would you do? Include them or exclude them on the contract, right? You only write them in the contract if you want to do the opposite of what they naturally do. Does that make sense? Yeah. So now let me give you an example of one you might see on the test. Okay? You ready to listen? Yeah. I'm gonna just make it up as I go. All right? I want you to pay attention. Okay? Travis is a listing broker for property at 123 Main Street in Garner, North Carolina. Upon viewing the home with the seller, Travis remarks about the beautiful crystal chandelier in the dining room. The seller responds that the crystal chandelier has great sentimental values that belong to the seller's grandmother and will not be part of the transaction. Travis makes a note of this in his marketing materials and goes on to tour the rest of the house. 2 weeks later, when placing the house on the market, Travis neglects to make any mention of the chandelier in his marketing materials. Buyer makes an offer subsequently on the property, and no mention of the chandelier is made in the contract. Upon closing, what is the legal status of the chandelier? And they're going to give you choices. One choice is going to be that the chandelier is the personal property of the seller because it had sentimental value. Is that the right answer? No. One choice is going to be that it is the personal property of the buyer because they bought it with a bill of sale. Is that going to be the right answer? No. One answer is going to be that it was real property and conveyed with the sale of the home. Is that right? Yes. Yes. Does it matter that the seller told Travis it wasn't going to be part of the sale? No. No. What matters? What's on the contract? And if no specific mention was made of it on the contract, it's what? It's real property, and therefore it conveyed. Does that make sense for everybody? Yes. That's the kind of question you're going to have to answer about this sort of thing. And they're going to throw that nonsense about, you know, that the agent was told that it wasn't going to be part of the transaction because they're trying to throw you off, right? Ultimately, does it matter that the agent was told? Not for the contract. It matters because the agent's probably going to get sued. It matters because the real estate commission is probably going to want to discipline that agent. But from a contractual standpoint, the contract is between the buyer and the seller. Does the buyer care that the agent didn't do their job? No. What they care about is I bought a house, and as far as I'm concerned, the damn chandelier's mine. Does that make sense? Yeah. So part of answering the questions in this class is weeding out the background noise. Get rid of what doesn't matter, that fluff, and they put it in every question. Those of you that have taken the class before, is that true? Yes. Yeah. They put it in every single one of these questions. I've always suspected they write the question and they go back and see if they can add 6 more sentences to it. Just to see what they're trying, you know, they give you way more than you need. Okay, to try to talk you into it being something else. Everybody good with this idea? Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Most houses have sheds in the backyard, and that's not part of the nail screw glue that you're talking about. So would that be real or personal, or is that something that would have to be written into the...
Let's ask ourselves 2 questions. Number 1, is it permanently attached?
In some cases, some sheds sit on
some sit on what?
Like a block.
Sit on a block.
Yes, and they're not permanently.
Is that permanently attached?
No.
It's attached to a foundation.
It's not attached to that foundation. Attached to a foundation, your house does not just sit on a foundation. It's bolted to that foundation. There are bolts that come up from that foundation wall, and then the house is bolted down to that foundation. It's called a sill plate. Is that shed permanently attached? No. In most cases? Sitting there. So, if it fails question number 1, what is it?
Personal property.
Personal property. You see how we take things and make them more and I'm not picking on about saying this, because it's a wonderful question. Because we look at something like a shed and we go, oh my God, we're not talking about that. Look how big that damn thing is. Does it matter how big it is? No. A motorhome's pretty damn big too. But it's personal property because it's movable. Does that make sense? If this thing is not permanently attached to the land in some fashion, it is personal property, and therefore it can be moved. So what would that tell you as a real estate broker if you were representing a buyer who was making an offer on that property? What do you think you had better do to protect your buyer? Well, you represent the buyer. If they ask the buyer, do you want the shed? Is the buyer going to assume the shed's part of the deal?
Yes.
Yes, and see, that part of doing your job as a broker is understanding what their perception is going to be. You can't sit around and wait for them to go. I've heard brokers say, well, if they had asked me the shed was not going to go, I would have told them. That is not good enough, because you're expected to anticipate that they won't know that. That they will not know that that shed's not part of the transaction. So when you see a potential trouble area like that, you should say to the buyer, now this shed's not part of the deal. Do you want the shed? And what's their answer going to be?
Yes.
Yes. And so what should you do with the contract when you make the offer? Write it in. Write it. That help? Yep. Because it would not be in most cases. Now, there could be sheds that are on permanent foundations, but the vast majority of them are just sitting on cinder blocks on the ground.
Like a carport, I guess that's still not attached to though. Carport.
Yeah, and unless you talking about like those aluminum carports, and not unless the legs are like concreted into the ground. Now, if it's got a pad, the concrete pad is certainly attached.
Right,
but
the
the carport itself, if you can pick it up and move it, it's not part of the deal. Yep. You know, basketball goals. You know, if it's buried in the ground, sure. But if it's the type that's got the, you know, just the base you fill up with water, it's not part of the deal. Not part of the deal. Not unless you want it to be. Here's a good one. An above ground swimming pool.
Right.
Folks, I have seen closings happen
And they don't want it.
where there's a deck around the pool, and they took the damn pool and just
Right.
left the deck with a hole in the middle of it
Yeah.
from an above ground pool. Because that pool is not attached. It's just sitting there. Above ground pools, they're not attached in any way. They're just sitting on top of the ground. That's it. Unless you grow up with rednecks like me. We had an above ground pool that was 8 feet deep. If you've ever seen one of those, you're probably the only people who have been to my house. Because my dad took an above ground pool and dug a hole 4 foot deep and set the above ground pool above the ground and then put the liner down into the ground. So we had an 8 foot deep above ground pool. It only sat 4 feet above the ground, but it was 8 feet deep. That only happens in Edgecombe County, by the way. It only happens in Edgecombe County. Of course, that's only half the story. My mom got so sick of the pool years later. She's a farm girl. She knows how to use machinery. My dad came home and she was getting dirt with the front end loader out of the field and filling in the pool. She's like, I have cleaned it for the last time. But these two questions always will answer, is it personal property or is it real property? These are the magic two. Okay? Can you apply that test?
Yeah.
Good.
So how do you know who attached it?
How do you know who attached it? Well, you have to ask. You have to ask. So one of the key things to recognize, Tom's question is, how do I know who attached it? How do I know if the tenant attached it? How do I know if the landlord attached it? Well, what would be the first thing you would look at if you were showing a house? Who's living there now? Is it the owner of the property? Well, if it's the owner of the property living there, I don't need to worry about who did the attaching. Because it can't be a tenant's property any longer because that tenant's not where? Not there any longer. Their lease is gone. And once their lease is over, anything that's there is there. Does that make sense? Because it's only their personal property until the lease expires. So it doesn't even matter if a tenant installed it if the tenant's gone. So the only time I'd be concerned about this is if the property was occupied by who right now? A tenant. This is when I'd be concerned about this. If I'm showing a property to my buyer and that property is currently occupied by a tenant, I need to ask the current owner the listing broker, both. Is there anything in this property that was installed by this tenant? Because what I would need to understand is that anything that is in that property that was installed by the tenant is not part of the sale. It's going to belong to the tenant. Does that make sense for everybody? By the way, when I said the fleas come with the dog, tenants are fleas. When you buy the property, you're buying the tenants too. Don't forget that. That lease survives that purchase. Many people have bought homes thinking they could just tell a tenant, oh, you got to move out now because it's my house and I want to move in. No, they don't. No, they don't. They have a lease and you have to honor it. And we have had people buy homes and not ask for copies of the lease only to find out that it was leased for 2 or 3 years after they purchased the property. You got to honor that lease.
Oh my gosh.
Got to honor it. Okay? So does that help with your question about when it would matter, when you'd be concerned about it?
Sure.
Yeah.
But then they have to pay the rent to the new owner.
They do have to pay the rent to the new owner, but you don't get to change the rent.
You can't change it.
So what if they've leased it to their cousin for $50 a month for 3 years? Could that happen?
Yeah.
Sure, absolutely.
They leased it to the cousin for 100 years.
No, well, we'll talk about that later in the class. There's some protections, and there's a reason I said 3 years. There's 3 years is sort of a magic number when it comes to leases. There's a reason I picked 3. It wasn't just a pull from number there. That was, let's put it this way, that's as bad as I could make it. Because anything longer than that, they'll have to do more than just have a lease. They'll have to record the lease. Okay? Does that make sense, though, about these 2 questions are going to be what you need to apply on a test and in real life. You know, if you're showing a property that's tenant occupied, that's an important question. Is there anything in here that belongs to the tenant? Because if it does, the tenant can always remove it. Like, for example, ceiling fans. If a tenant puts ceiling fans in all the bedrooms, can they take the ceiling fans out when their lease is up?
Yep.
As long as they do what?
Put it back to its
Put it back to its original condition. Well, if you're showing a buyer that property and they see ceiling fans in every bedroom, might that be a selling point for them?
Yes.
And then all of a sudden they buy it and the tenant moves out and they don't have ceiling fans anymore. They're going to be upset with you as a real estate broker. Guess who's going to be buying ceiling fans? Yeah. Break out your checkbook. Yeah. You're going to have to do that a few times in this business. We all do at some point, sooner or later. Here's what I'll tell you about making a mistake in this business. You can pay, or you can get in trouble and pay. Those are your 2 options when it comes to this business. Because if you've messed up and you've cost somebody money, when they come and complain, you can say, you know what, I take complete ownership of that. Let me make it right for you. And you know what you just did? You built a client for life. Or you can look at them and go, I am not paying for that mess. And then they're going to march right down there and file a complaint with the real estate commission. And the real estate commission is going to discipline you. And then they're going to go to the Wake County Courthouse and file a lawsuit against you. And they're going to win the lawsuit. And not only are you going to have to pay for whatever it is you messed up, but you're going to have to pay their court costs and their attorney's fees. And you're going to get disciplined by the real estate commission. Which option sounds better to you? Hey! Write the damn check. This is why we make thousands of dollars on a transaction, because sometimes you're going to buy somebody a refrigerator. You know how I know it's going to happen? Because I've done it. I've done it. You know why? You know why it happened? Because I wrote refrigerator in a contract. Now, I knew I had to write it in as personal property, right? You have to write it in to be included. And I did. You know what I wrote on there? Refrigerator.
They changed that.
They changed it. Assholes.
Wow.
We went and did the walkthrough, and that beautiful stainless steel refrigerator was sitting in that house. After we left and went to the attorney's office, they swapped it out with the old refrigerator from before they had remodeled the kitchen. And so when my clients went back to their brand new house, they found a 10-year-old white refrigerator sitting in the kitchen. Who do you think bought them a stainless steel refrigerator? I did. You know why? Because it's my fault. What did I write in the contract? I wrote refrigerator. That's what they left. A refrigerator, right? Because could they have left the dorm refrigerator and been just fine too? Listen, I take a picture of the serial number now. You're not going to do that to me again. I write the serial number, the make, the model, the whole 9 yards in there. And if you ever come to my house and you go out to the garage and get a beer, guess what refrigerator you're going to get out of? The most expensive white used refrigerator you've ever seen in your life. And I keep it just as a reminder of that. That's exactly right. That's the problem. I mean, honestly, when you're going to make mistakes in this business. We all do. Pay for them. Because you're ultimately going to pay one way or the other. Because they hold us responsible. That is our job. Our job is to protect them. Right? And if we don't, then we just have to be responsible for it. The idea is to minimize those mistakes, to hopefully learn from other people so you don't have to learn that lesson yourself. I don't want you to buy a refrigerator. Next time you write refrigerator into a contract, I want you to remember, don't do that. Travis did that and he got screwed, right? So what do you know already?
Serial number.
Serial number. And that's exactly what I do. If I know my client's going to ask for the refrigerator, I pull my phone out and I go right in there, open the refrigerator door, and snap a picture. And then when I'm writing the contract, I pull that picture up, so I've got the serial number and I write it into the contract. It only takes one time getting burned like that. I had a really good friend in the business, and she's also an instructor. She's brilliant. She's great. In another part of the state, and she called me about 6 months ago. It's the funniest. I think it's one of the funniest things. I feel bad for her. I shouldn't laugh at her expense, but one of the funniest things there. She said, "I need some help." I said, "What do you need help on?" "Well, I sold a house, and I marketed the sewer as a fire pit." And I said, "Michelle, you did what?" And she said, "Well, it wasn't my fault." I said, "I hope not." So here's what had happened. She went and looked at the house. She toured the house with the seller. And in the middle of the backyard was a nice fire pit. Benches around it, patio, the whole nine, stacked stone, the whole 9 yards with the little fire pit grid on top of it. This was a damn water collection point for the neighborhood. And it was ugly. So the guy that owned the house had made it look like a fire pit. Well, she didn't actually go out there and take the cover off of it and look at it. She's looking out there and she sees fire pits, she sees benches, she said, so, and she said, I even mentioned, "Oh, I like your fire pit," and the guy never said anything. The seller never said anything. So she has her photographer take pictures where she puts it on the MLS, and she's like one of the pictures said, "Enjoy nights out by your beautiful fire pit." And so the house sells, and a month later she gets a phone call because the buyer's gone out there. He wants to light a fire in his fire pit. And you know what he finds? The stormwater collection drain when he takes the cover off of that thing. And I said, after I stopped laughing, I said, "What do they want?" And she said, "Well, they want a fire pit." I said, "Then buy them a fire pit." And she said, "But it's not my fault, Travis." I said, "I get that. But who put a picture on the internet and said, 'Enjoy nights by your fire pit'?" I'm pretty sure that wasn't the seller. That was you. I said, and whether I get it that you got completely hoodwinked in this thing, but it's not the buyer's fault. The buyer's looking at you because you marketed the property. We all agree with that? Yeah. And this is what I reminded her. I said, "Listen, Michelle, as much as it sucks to do that, what's going to be worse? Right. Saying no, let them go file a complaint at the real estate commission, then sue you. Right. You get disciplined. You still have to pay. And once you pay them, they're still mad at you. Or you go out there and you say, 'Guys, I am so sorry. I mean, quite honestly, I am floored by this because the seller told me it was a fire pit and I just never went. I would have never in a million years said that and done that. I am so sorry to have inconvenienced you. Tell me what I can do to make it better.'" I said, "You will take those people and turn them into clients for life by doing it that way. And it's going to be cheaper and without the added benefit of getting in trouble." Right? That's what you do in this business. That's what you do. It's not on the test, by the way. But you'll need to know it once you actually get involved. Okay? I always budget about 5% of my income in any given year to cover up my mistakes. Miscellaneous mistakes. Or just settling arguments. You'd be shocked at what people would argue about on a $400,000 transaction, and they're arguing about. I had one. I've been a broker in charge for years. I'm no longer a broker in charge. As of
Congratulations.
2 weeks ago, that's the most wonderful thing in the world. I supervised 110 agents. I built the firm from 0 to 110, and I let somebody else have it. Whew, thank God. Because y'all are crazy once you get a license. I had one of my agents, she came in my office about 3 years ago, and she was so mad. And I said, Karen, what are you mad about? We're supposed to close today, and these stupid sellers have taken the air conditioning with them. And I'm like, they took the air conditioning with them, you know? And she's just ranting and raving and on and on. And I'm like, well, how in the, you know, I'm trying to picture how they took the air. Did they back a truck up to the side of the house? Come to find out, here's what they're talking about. A window air conditioner in the shed. And she and the listing agent, she's on the buyer side, other agent on the listing side, are having a knockdown, drag-out, claws and eyeballs fight over a window air conditioner. It's a $500,000 transaction. $15,000 in commission on each side. I said, Karen, go to Lowe's and buy an air conditioner. It's not my fault. I'm like, who cares? It's standing between you and $15,000. The thing costs $300. Go buy it and tell them Happy New Year, Merry Christmas, whatever. Just get it done. You see what I mean? Sometimes you got to simplify your life, folks, and you just got to budget for that in this business. There are going to be times when somebody punches a hole in the wall when they're moving out, and what I've come to learn is it's a lot easier for me to send my handyman over there and pay for getting it fixed than it is to tell them, well, you got to get this done, because then they don't get it done, or they get it halfway done, or they get, you know. Just don't worry about it. I got it. I got it. That's budgeted into my cost. When you hire me, I've already budgeted in the I hate dealing with you part of the transaction. It's already a line item. It's already been planned for. Cleaning the house. I got so tired over the years of yelling at my sellers about cleaning the house up when they were moving out. I mean, you'd be ashamed to see how some people leave their house for somebody else to move into it. So, you know, finally I figured out, it's not their fault for not cleaning, it's my fault for doing the same thing over and over and over. Stop begging them to clean it and just hire a cleaner. So you know what I did? I turned it into a marketing opportunity for myself. So now when I go to a listing presentation, here's what I tell the seller. You don't have to worry about cleaning. You just get your things moved out. I'm going to hire a professional cleaning service to come in here and clean it for you. I never meant that to be a marketing tool. I was doing it because they're nasty and they didn't do it themselves. But if I was going to have to pay for it, I turned it into a positive marketing tool for myself. Does that make sense? You got to do a lot of that in this business. It's a customer service-based business. Okay? All right. So we already talked about improvements. What did we say an improvement was? It's anything that humans have done what? Built on a piece of property that does what to the value of the property? Adds value. So give me some examples of improvements.
A deck.
A sprinkler system, a deck,
Fencing.
fencing. What else? A fire pit. I'll tell Michelle you said so. A burglar alarm would be an improvement. How about sewer lines? Water lines? Sidewalk. Would a sidewalk be an improvement? Later on in class, we're going to talk about how you might get improvements that you didn't even want. Did you know that can happen? Yep. What if the city comes in and says, oh, we'd like you to have sidewalks?
Is that eminent domain?
That is not eminent domain. It's called a special assessment.
Oh,
But they can give you sidewalks. If they're not giving you a sidewalk, because it's an improvement. And we say an improvement does what to your property value? It adds value. So if it adds value, of course, they can bill you for it. So they can come in and decide you need sidewalks and put them in for you and then bill you for them. It's called a special assessment. Okay, everybody all right with that? Get that for water and sewer too. If you live in an area that doesn't have water and sewer, you get annexed by the city. They come in, they run the water and sewer lines out to your house. You don't even get tapped on. They're just out there, and you might be able to use them. Here's a $10,000 bill for you. It happens. You might learn things you didn't want to know in this class, by the way. All right, let's talk about some estates. Now, I will warn you in advance. Those of you who have taken the class know that this is a frustrating section. I told you we were going to get you right in there on day one, right? Well, this is it. This is when you're going to not like me anymore. He was fun until 3 o'clock. And we started talking about life estates, and I just wanted to die. Estates. So the first thing we need to talk about is what is an estate, period. What is an estate? An estate is your legal relationship to a piece of property. So if Donna owns a piece of property, that is her estate in the property. She is the owner of the property. Does that make sense? If Isaiah leases a piece of property, then he has a leasehold estate in that property. You follow me on that? So your estate in a property is just a fancy way of saying, what is your relationship to the property? An estate is a relationship. You can substitute those two words for each other. So an ownership estate is an ownership relationship. Does that make sense for everybody? Are you with me on this? It's a tough word, but don't make it a tough word. It's just the legal relationship. When we talk about what is Tara's estate in this property, we're just simply asking, does she own it? Does she lease it? Is she a tenant? Is she a landlord? What is her legal relationship to this piece of real estate? Everybody good with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's what an estate is. Now, there are two major categories of estates. There are estates of ownership. I own it. And there are lease estates. I rent it. It would be nice if we could use real words, but we don't. We use fake made-up words like freehold. I don't know who made it up. I'd like to throw a brick at them if I could find them. But a freehold interest is an ownership interest. When you have a freehold estate, what is your legal relationship to the property? You own it. You are the owner of the property. Owners of real estate have freehold interests in that property. Is everybody okay with that? Are we okay with that kind of terminology? So far, so good? Leasehold estates are people who have lease interests in property. Now, the name of this chapter is property ownership, right? So which one of these you think we're going to talk about for the rest of this chapter? Freehold. We're going to talk about freehold ownership. Freehold ownership. Now look at this chart. This is what we have to get through. This is what we have to... Doesn't this make great sense to you right now? If it does, then I feel sorry for you. If it doesn't, then join the rest of us, because it shouldn't make sense to you yet. But hopefully by the time we end this discussion, it will make sense to you. These are all of the different types of freehold ownerships. If you notice, there's nothing broken off of the leasehold. All of this is ownership of some type. Does that make sense for everybody? All of these are different methods that you can own a piece of real property. You thought ownership was one thing, didn't you? And it mostly is. But we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the stuff other than mostly. Let's talk about mostly first. Mostly. In other words, 99.9% of the time, freehold ownership comes in one form 99.9% of the time. It is called fee simple absolute. Sometimes just fee simple. Fee simple absolute ownership. What did I say it was? Fee simple absolute. The most important word is the second one. What is it? Simple. Simple. This is what you think of when you think of ownership. This is the kind of ownership you associate with ownership right now. Before we talk about any of the rest of this nonsense. When you own a piece of property, what can you do with it?
Use it.
What else other than sell it? So, I heard somebody say anything. I know, right? Anything you want, right? Because it's yours. How long do you own it? Forever. That's fee simple absolute. Fee simple absolute means two things. You own it forever. There's no limit on the time you own it. You own it until you don't want to own it anymore. Is that fair to say? For most of you, who owns their house here? How long you own it? Forever. Or until you decide you don't want to anymore.
Well, we
Do you agree with that?
Can't.
Does everybody agree with that?
Yes, sir.
You can do anything you want to do. So there's no restriction on time. There's no restriction on use. That is fee simple absolute. And the vast majority of property in this country, and when I say vast is an understatement, the overwhelming majority of property in this country is owned fee simple absolute. If you own your house, I can almost guarantee you with certainty you own it. Fee simple absolute. Whether you have a mortgage on it or not does not matter. We've not gotten to financing yet. But you own it fee simple absolute. Because two things are true. You own it for how long? Forever. And what can you do with it?
Whatever.
Whatever. Forever, whatever. That's fee simple absolute. Everybody so far so good on that? It would be nice if we could just introduce you to that and say, if you run into anything else, go talk to an attorney. That's not the way it works on this test, though. All the rest of the stuff we're going to talk about are the exceptions to the rule. The stuff you probably will never come across in your whole real estate career. But you've got to know them for the test. You have to know them for the test because this is too easy. I mean, nobody would miss a question about this, right? You know, what's fee simple absolute ownership? Well, I can do whatever the hell I want to do with it for as long as I want to. Pretty easy to explain that, isn't it?
I like it.
Yeah, that's it, you know. But we want to talk about the exceptions. So let's start breaking down the exceptions. Remember, there were two things that were unlimited about fee simple absolute. What were they? What were the two things unlimited about fee simple absolute? Time and use. So let's start breaking them down. Let's first talk about limiting time. A time limitation on ownership. Limiting, now it's still a freehold interest. What does that word freehold mean?
A lifetime, forever.
No, it doesn't mean forever.
Ownership.
Freehold means ownership, right? Don't confuse fee simple absolute and freehold. You know, fee simple absolute is a type of freehold interest, right? But all of the ownerships fall under freehold. Is everybody okay with that?
Yeah.
This is also going to be, let me skip ahead here. This, a life estate, is also going to be a freehold interest. That means it's an ownership interest. That means the person we're talking about, what is their legal relationship to the property? What is their estate in the property? They are the owner of the property. Now, before we go any deeper here, let me get some clarification. I find what happens when we get into life estates and we get into fee simple to feasible, is that you get so deep in the details that you lose sight of the big picture. Okay? These are ownership interest people. If I ask you a simple question, can you sell that piece of property? If you're the owner, what's the answer?
Yes.
Yes. That's not going to change. The fact that this is a life estate is not going to change that you can sell it. Because if you own it, can you sell it?
Yes.
You can always sell what you own, correct? Is everybody with me on that? Can you use what you own? Yes. Is that going to change if it's a life estate? No. Can you give it away? Yes. It's yours. You own it. Do you have to pay taxes on it? Do you have to maintain it?
Yes.
All those things stay true. Don't lose sight of it is ownership. The only difference between a life estate and fee simple absolute is time. Remember, how long do we own a fee simple absolute interest?
Forever.
Forever
And ever.
and ever. Life estates have a time limitation on them. It is ownership. No different than fee simple absolute, except you only own it for a limited what? Time. That's a life estate. Everybody with me so far? So, a life estate is an ownership interest where the owner of the property is only going to own the property for a limited amount of time. And that amount of time is not in their control. It is outside of their control. Somebody set a countdown timer on their ownership when they handed it to them. Remember we talked about those OR and EE suffixes first thing today? And the OR is the giver. So look, I want to talk to you about one right now. Grant. When you transfer ownership of property, the word grant is the word that we use. So the grantor, you think that's going to be the seller or the buyer? Seller. The grantee is going to be the buyer. Does that make sense for you? So the grantor is the one who's giving over ownership. Are you with me so far? Here's what's happened in a life estate. In a life estate, the grantor has transferred ownership. But rather than transferring fee simple ownership, which would be for how long? Forever. The grantor has chosen to transfer ownership for a limited amount of time. Charlotte is going to own this property until Charlotte dies. Would you agree that Charlotte is going to die at some point?
Yes.
So, would you agree that her ownership is now limited in time? Somebody has turned an hourglass on her ownership. And it just so happens that an ownership time coincides with what? Her what?
Yeah.
And what's the opposite of death?
Right.
See why it's called a life estate? A life estate is ownership limited in time. And the thing that marks the time is somebody's lifetime. It is ownership granted to somebody for a lifetime. Now, it could be for their own lifetime or for somebody else's lifetime. It doesn't have to be. I said Charlotte owns it till Charlotte dies. Whose life are we depending on here now? Charlotte's. I could also say Charlotte owns it until Liz dies. That works as well. Whose life do we depend on now?
Liz.
Liz. It's still a life estate. Because is it a limited amount of time? And that time is limited to what? Somebody's lifetime. That's a life estate. Does everybody understand what we're doing here? We are granting ownership. And people say to me all the time, well, why would somebody do that? I don't know. Because people do crazy things. I actually do know. There are times when you might want to do this. I'll give you an example. My grandfather had a life estate and a farm. We have a family farm in Edgecombe County. It's our farm. Been in our family since the 1700s. But when I was growing up, we had two farms. We also owned the farm next door. Or my grandfather did. What I didn't understand at the time was he had a life estate in that farm. The people who owned that farm had no children. And they were elderly when he was a young man. He took care of them. And when they died, they left in their will their farm to him as a life estate. He was left their farm until what happened? Until he died. So for his whole lifetime, that farm belonged to him. Could he rent it out?
Yeah.
Could he farm it? Could he rent the house out to somebody? Could he have sold the farm if he wanted to? Sure, he owns it. He can do whatever he wants to with it. You following me so far? It's ownership for a limited amount of time. Are you with me on that? Now what happened when he died?
That's a good question.
We haven't talked about that, right? Well, what do you think happened as far as his ownership went?
It
Goes away.
goes away.
From his perspective, all he knows is it's not there anymore, right?
Back to the original.
Could he leave it to us as an inheritance?
No.
No, because as soon as he ceased to breathe,
Wasn't his.
it wasn't his anymore. Does that make sense for you guys?
Yeah.
But he could have
Yes.
sold it.
He could have sold it. So let's talk about that. What did he own? He owned the farm
Right.
until he died.
Right.
What you can sell is exactly what you own. Manny, you own the calculator until you die. Can you sell the calculator?
Sure, until you die.
Exactly. You can sell the calculator to Donna, but what did Donna buy? She bought the calculator
As a life estate.
until
He died.
Manny dies. Because Manny can only sell what he owns in the first place. And he doesn't have fee simple absolute ownership. What he has is ownership until he dies. So he can sell exactly what he's got. So if Donna buys it, she's buying the calculator until what happens? Until Manny dies. Because that's what
Be
you know.
well.
So Donna is going to be visiting you at your bedside and taking good care of you. Does that make you following me so far in this life estate? Are we getting there, kind of mentally?
Yeah.
All right? So it's a time-limited thing. So let's talk about some of the key terms here with life estates. The life tenant. This is a confusing word because we tend to think of tenants as people who are renting. In this case, this is the owner. This is the owner of the property. But they're the owner for a limited amount of what? Time. Charlotte owns it till Charlotte dies. She's the life tenant. Because who owns it? Charlotte. That makes her the life tenant. Is everybody okay with that? We also have this person called the measuring life. The measuring life has one job. Breathe. Breathe. Because this ownership only lasts until that stops happening. In this case, Charlotte owns it until Charlotte dies. Charlotte is the life tenant, correct? Because she owns the property. Who's the measuring life?
The person whose life or
Charlotte owns it till Charlotte dies. Who is the measuring life? Charlotte. She is both the life tenant and the measuring life. Does that make sense? Charlotte owns it until Liz dies. Charlotte is the what? Life tenant, and Liz is the measuring life. What interest does Liz have in the property? Nothing. She gets nothing out of this deal. She gets to breathe. That's it. She's not going to get any rent. She's not even going to get a thank you note from Charlotte. She gets nothing. Because all the benefit goes to the life tenant. Does that make sense? Is everybody with me so far on this? So the life tenant is the person who owns it. The measuring life is the person who's going to continue breathing. They keep the time for us. They're the timekeeper. I asked you a question earlier. I said, what happened to that farm that my grandfather had a life estate in when he died? And I said, well, we hadn't gotten there yet. Well, then the natural question you should come up with is what happens, right? Because if somebody only owns something for a limited amount of time, I'm pretty sure that farm didn't just disintegrate and blow off the face of the planet when my grandfather passed away. So what's the natural question that should pop into your head?
Does it go back to the original owner?
Where does it go? Who owns the damn thing now? Does that make sense? And that's always going to be the question with a life estate, because the one sure thing of a life estate is the ownership's going to end, because the measuring life's always going to do what? Always going to die. So every life estate is going to come to an end. This is where this idea of a remainder man or a reversionary interest comes into play. These are the people who are going to get it after the measuring life has died. After the life estate ends. Because when the measuring life dies, would you agree that the life estate's over? Does that make sense? So these are the people who are going to take ownership of the property afterward. Is everybody good with that? Why do we have two different names for them? Well, the grantor. This is all in control of the original grantor. When I say, Charlotte, you own this property until Liz dies. Charlotte is the life tenant, right? And Liz is the measuring life. What am I? I'm the grantor. I'm the one setting the rules. I'm the one transferring ownership to Charlotte. Who gave me the right to tell Charlotte that she only owns it until Liz dies? I did, because it's my property. I own it. And I own it fee simple absolute. So I got all the cards. Does that make sense with you? So the grantor is going to determine not only who the life tenant is, who the measuring life is, but what happens to it afterward. Does that make sense for you? In this case, what did I say about what happens to it afterward? Charlotte owns it till Liz died. What did I say about afterward? I didn't. You know what's going to happen?
It's going to revert back to you.
Say that word again.
It's going to revert back to you.
What was that word? Revert. What does that sound like up there? A reversionary interest. If I don't say what's going to happen with it, it's going to revert right back to me. Charlotte owns it till Liz dies. Well, when Liz dies, guess what happens with the property? Right back to me.
So what happens when the grantor dies?
What? And so there's a great question, Melissa. So what if you're dead?
It goes to
It goes to my heirs.
because you have the
It goes to my heirs, because how long am I going to own it?
you you have fee simple ones.
Forever. What kind of ownership am I going to get? Fee simple absolute, which lasts forever. So if I happen to be dead, it reverts back to me, which is the same thing as reverting back to my heirs, my line of ownership. Does that make sense? I could also, as the original grantor, name where it goes other than me. Charlotte owns the property until Liz dies, and then it goes to Kelly.
Do you have two measuring?
No, I don't have to measure lines. Charlotte is the life tenant, right?
Okay.
Liz is the measuring line.
She's the remainder.
Kelly is the remainder woman in this case.
That's right, remainder
The
woman.
remainder person,
There you
right?
go.
She's the remainder man. If the grantor names a specific recipient at the end of this thing, it's called a remainder man, a remainder interest. If the grantor doesn't say what's going to happen with it, what's it going to do? It reverts back to the grantor. That's a reversionary interest. Do you see the difference? So if the grantor says, this is what's going to happen, and as soon as the life estate's over, this is who it goes to, that's a remainder interest. If the grantor says, this is what happens, but they're silent about what happens at the end of it, it's a what? Reversionary interest. Okay? So Carolyn owns it till Carolyn dies, and then it goes to Melissa. Remainder or reversionary? Carolyn owns it till Carolyn dies, and then it goes to Melissa. Remainder or reversionary? Remainder. Why is it a remainder? Because the grantor chose where it was going when it was done. I was explicit about what was going to happen with it. Who do we know is ultimately going to end up owning this property? Melissa, correct? And how is she going to end up owning it? Fee simple absolute. So how long is she going to own it? Forever. What can she do with it? Anything. Does that make sense?
Total sense.
Yes, sir, Dave.
So if the remainder man or the remainder person
Today.
passes before the measuring line, then it goes to a reversionary? No?
She lives forever.
Oh, okay.
Because she lives in the form of who? Her heirs.
Gotcha.
So if she happens to be dead, it would go to her heirs, whomever her heirs were. It would still be a remainder interest.
And why don't we just cut out the middle person and just give it to them?
So that's a great question. Tarajo's question is a good one. Why worry about the middle person? Go back to my grandfather. The remainder man in that case was his children's home in North Carolina. They wanted to donate the farm to charity. But they wanted to do what for my granddad? They wanted to look after him. Because he did what? He took care of them. So they left him a life estate in the farm. By the way, he was 28 when they died and he lived to be 85.
Wow.
They left him a life estate in the farm for his lifetime. And then it went to the children's home in North Carolina. So does that help answer the question of why you would maybe want to structure something that way?
It does, but you can kind of, if you already know, then you can kind of state that I want this property to go to your grandfather, and then I want it to go to his children when he passes away. Can you just put that in the agreement instead of, deciding from measuring somebody's life? Because now you put a stamp on it.
When you say, I want it to go here when he passes away, that is a life estate. Because anytime you're tying it to somebody's lifetime, that's a life estate. And as a matter of fact, the only way you can limit time and ownership is a life estate. You have to tax somebody's life.
But in the case that she's talking about, just letting it go to your grandfather's heirs, it would just be just a fee simple. It wouldn't be.
That's
like,
exactly
right.
right. If they had just left him the farm, we would still own the farm.
Right, right.
Wish they had.
I know.
Does that make sense for everybody? It's not our farm now. It's not the children's home in North Carolina either. They sold it instantly. Well, yeah, of course. They don't want a farm. They want the money. They put it up for sale and sold it. Yeah.
So who's responsible for the taxes? Is it the...
Who would be responsible for the taxes? The owner of the property. And who's the owner of the property? While the life estate's going on, it's the life tenant, right? Yeah.
But in the instance of the reversionary,
Then who pays the taxes?
Who pays the taxes?
The person is dead though.
No. Who pays the taxes on anything? Answer it in a simple way. Who pays taxes on something?
He does, so.
Not he. Who pays taxes? No. There we go. There's the word I'm looking for. Who pays the taxes? What's the answer? The owner. So, if the life estate's still going on, who's the owner? The life tenant. If the life estate's over, it's going to be either the reversionary or remainder, whichever one you have. They're going to pay the taxes because it's whoever owns the property at that point in time. See, we try to make it much more complex than it is. Who pays the taxes? The person who owns it. Could my grandfather have sold the farm?
Yeah.
Yes. But what did he own? He owned the farm until he died. So anybody that bought the farm from him would have only been purchasing the farm until he died.
Would that deter a lot of sell? I mean, would that create a
Of course it would. Would it make it nearly impossible to sell such? Just because I said you could sell it doesn't mean somebody's actually going to buy it, right? Because think of, I mean, what a chance you would be taking. You know, like, die tomorrow for all you know. Does that make sense? So it can be sold, but what never changes is that measuring life. That measuring life is locked in by the original grantor. It can be sold, it can be given away, it can be inherited away. All these things can happen, but what never changes is the measuring life. So I'll give you one. Charlotte owns it till Liz dies. Charlotte has passed away. Now think about how I started this conversation. I said, what happened? Charlotte, what? Owns it until what? Liz dies. But then I say, who did I say died? Charlotte. Charlotte's lifetime have anything to do with anything on this thing? No. Does Charlotte still own it, even though she's dead? Yes. She does, and she owns it in the form of her who? Heirs. Her heirs. What did they inherit? They inherited the property until Liz dies.
So it goes back to Liz.
Well, it's not going to go to Liz, because Liz is the measuring life. Liz has got nothing to do with the property.
Remainder.
It's going to go back to either a remainder or a reversionary. Which one is it in this case? Charlotte owns it till Liz dies. Remainder or reversionary? It doesn't depend. Does not depend. It's going to be reversionary because I didn't say. I didn't say. That's the key to a reversionary. Does that make sense for everybody? When I don't say what's going to happen, that is reversionary. It's coming back to me. That's the same thing as saying I want it back. But if I name someone else other than me, then it's what? It's remainder.
So I'm going to give you a classic example, Travis. So let's say
he's going to give me a
all of them are driving in a car. All of your grantor, your lieutenant, all of these guys are driving the same car. They make an accident. All of them. I'm sorry.
Got to be one in every room.
Sorry, I'm trying to understand the rules. That's all.
Everybody's in the car and the car blows up. Is that where we're going? I got a feeling that's where we're going, right? Everybody's in the car. Everybody's in the car. So let's just do it. Conti, you own the property until Carolyn dies. All right, and then it's going to Evilise. Okay. What is Conti? Conti owns it till Carolyn dies, and then it goes to Evilise. Conti's what? Lieutenant. What is Carolyn? Measuring life. And what is Evilise? Remainder man. Everybody good with that? Yes. They all had a party. Conti's driving. Runs off the road, side of a mountain, boom, gone. Right? Everybody dead. Where's the property going to go?
The remainder man's heirs.
The remainder man's heirs. We'll go to Evilise's heirs because your ownership ends the moment Carolyn passes away. Not when you die, but when Carolyn dies, when the measuring life dies, right? And as soon as the measuring life dies, ownership transfers to remainder man, and if remainder man happens to be dead, then it goes to the heirs of remainder man.
She has no heirs, it goes to the state.
We ain't got there yet, but yes. But yes. That is exactly right. Mackenzie, did I see your hand?
This may not have anything to do with it, but it's just where my brain's going. What if your grandfather didn't want the farm? Like he couldn't afford it at the time, he didn't have the money to do anything, pay the property taxes. what would happen? Does he have a choice in that? Or?
Like, you could have jumped off a cliff and think that would take it. I'm just kidding. That's not a good option. That's an interesting question. I don't know what would happen in a case like that, because you can't be forced to take ownership. You have to voluntarily take ownership of a property. I mean, again, I can't think of an instance where somebody wouldn't want it, because, again, it created revenue for him. You know, he farmed it. There was a house on there that he rented out for 50-some years, that he rented that house out and got rental income from that house. He was able to cut the timber on the property, and, you know, I mean, there was a lot of income made over the years from that property. I don't know the answer to that. If somebody refused ownership, what would happen? My guess is it would probably just go straight to the remainder man.
That's what I was thinking. How would it go straight?
That's what happened with my mom's parents died. They had a tobacco farm, got timber from it, all this stuff, but her sister didn't want the part of it, but she didn't really know what her options were, so she just kept it. Like, she didn't have the money to keep up with the rental house and everything else, and it's in the middle of Chapel Hill, so there's not a lot of people renting houses and stuff. My mom ended up taking it, but at the time, like, she didn't really know what her options were.
I mean, I'm a generous guy, so I'll take it. You know,
and
you ever
she didn't
need somebody
live here.
next time that comes up, I'll give you my card.
She didn't live here, so she didn't really have the opportunity to, like, really take care of it and find a renter and all that stuff. So I didn't know if she had any legal way of saying, I don't want this.
Well, the legal way is a quitclaim deed. She could simply transfer the property over to somebody else who was willing to take it.
Yeah, and that's what happened. But I didn't know if, when they're making the life estate, do you have to sign off on it saying, yeah, I'll take this property?
No.
Okay, that's what I thought.
You do not.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, my grandfather had no idea until they passed away when their will was read.
Oh, wow.
He had no idea. And I don't think he really understood it for a long time, to be honest with you. You know, exactly what he did have. I mean, somebody just one day said, this is yours.
Yeah.
You know, and he eventually understood it was his until I didn't understand it. I thought it was our farm. I'm like, I remember, it was well before he died that I realized it wasn't, but I mean, as a kid, I was like, what do you mean that's not our farm? And Mom's like, it's your grandfather's, but not forever. I'm like, what does that mean? Yeah. So I've been studying this stuff since I was in like middle school, because I was trying to figure out what the heck we had there. Is everybody okay with this so far? Okay. Now, go one level deeper on life estates, and then I promise we're done with the depth of it. We need to label whether it's a conventional life estate or a life estate pour autre vie. This sounds complex. It is not. A conventional life estate is when the measuring life and the life tenant are the same person. Charlotte owns it until who dies? Charlotte dies. That's a conventional life estate. Could a conventional life estate have a reversionary interest? Yes. Could a conventional life estate have a remainder interest?
Yes.
Yes. Remainder and reversionary have nothing to do with conventional. The only thing that makes it conventional is that Charlotte is both the measuring life and who? The life tenant. Charlotte owns it, that's the life tenant part, until Charlotte dies. That's the measuring life part. How many people are we talking about? Just one. That's a conventional life estate. In other words, you own it for your lifetime. Does that make sense? Because if you think about a life estate, that's the thing that makes the most sense. If you're going to leave somebody a life estate, most likely you're leaving it to them for their lifetime. Wouldn't that follow? It's not required that you do it that way. You could do something called a life estate pour autre vie. That translates to for the life of another. Charlotte owns it until Liz dies. Who is the life tenant? Charlotte. Who's the measuring life? Liz. One person or two different people? Two different people. That is a life estate pour autre vie. Could that have a remainder interest?
Yes.
Could it have a reversionary interest? Does that have anything to do with the pour autre vie part? No. Pour autre vie just means different person measuring life and life tenant. Right? Yes, sir, Isaiah.
So Liz died, that means she got to move out? Charlotte got to move out?
If Liz dies, does Charlotte have to move out of the property? Charlotte owns it till Liz dies. What does that mean when Liz dies? She no longer owns the property, so does she have to move out?
Yes.
Absolutely. She doesn't own it anymore. It's not hers any longer.
Can the new owner still let her live?
could a new owner lease it to her? What do you think the answer to that is? Yes, because the owner can do whatever they want to do.
So in this case, there's no remainder and no reversionary?
Well, there's got to be one. There's got to be a remainder or a reversionary, right? Because it's got to go somewhere, right? So Charlotte owns it till Liz dies. First of all, is it a conventional life estate or is it a life estate pour altruve? Pour altruve. Is it remainder or is it reversionary?
It's reversionary.
Reversionary, because I didn't do what? I didn't specify what was going to happen. So put it all together. It is a life estate pour altruve with a reversionary interest. That's how you put it all together. Does that make sense for everybody?
So if your grandfather sold the property, then it would revert to a pour altruve.
That's a wonderful question. So here's Tom's question. This is a deep question. Ready for it?
Yeah.
If my grandfather had sold the property, because my grandfather had a conventional life estate, he owned it until what? Until he died. He's the measuring life, he's the life tenant, right? If he had sold the farm to somebody, so let's say he sells the farm to Demetrius. You're in the same county, around the corner, right? Tarboro, in the house. Demetrius buys the farm from my grandfather. What did he buy? The farm until my grandfather died. So Demetrius is now the what? The owner. And what do we call the owner in a life estate? Demetrius is now the life tenant. Who's the measuring life? My grandfather. So is that now a conventional life estate or is that now a life estate pour altruve? It's now a life estate. That's what you were asking, right? It's now a life estate pour altruve because they're two separate people. Because what never changes is the measuring life. The measuring life stays the same. How do we feel about that? Pretty decent? If you feel even remotely decent, that's pretty good. I'll be honest with you. Because life estates are one of those things that are ultra confusing to people. Those of you that have been through the class before, are life estates confusing?
Yeah, you explained it so much.
I get it now.
You get it now?
It's insane. It's totally clicking in my head.
Good.
It's so much different.
No, it's not.
I'm going to repeat this question for everybody. So I always like to repeat people's questions so that everybody can hear them because I realize it's tough with this many people in the room. Melissa's question was, she feels like you said stepfather-in-law, is that right? Your father-in-law, okay, sorry, not stepfather. Father-in-law has done a life estate with his wife, right? That if something happens to him, his will says that she would get ownership until she dies, and then it would go to his children. Is everybody with me on that? So, he's left in his will a life estate. He's created a life estate through his will, because at his death, ownership is going to convey to his spouse for how long? Until she dies, and then what's going to happen with it? And then it's going to go back to his children. I'm assuming this must be a second marriage. Is that what it is? Is that why we're getting all convoluted here? That marriage word confuses everything, by the way, when it comes to property ownership. But does everybody understand what he's doing here? So now what kind of life estate is that going to be? His wife is going to own it until she dies. Is that conventional or is that pour altruve? Conventional. She owns it until she dies. No. His will says that when he dies, he's going to give her ownership until she dies. She's the measuring life, she's the life tenant. That's a conventional life estate, right? And the remainder man is who? The children. Does that make sense for you now? And he's the what?
He's the grantor.
I thought you said, is he the Grinch? I don't know. Yes, he's the grantor. He's the...
If they didn't have that in place, would it automatically go to the spouse, or it has to be written up?
So here, Leela or Lila? I'm sorry, Lila. I know. I'll get it. I promise. Lila's question was, does it have to be in the will that way, or would it automatically go to his spouse? That's That's an important question for a marital attorney. We're going to talk about marriage rights and how it impacts ownership significantly, but there's differences between purchasing property as a married couple and coming into ownership as a result of marriage, okay? And it sounds like to me, this is property he owned previous to this marriage, and then he married his spouse. That's different than property he purchases with his spouse. She has a marital interest, not an entirety interest. Those are two different things, okay? And I don't want to get into marital law. I don't want to get anything about marriage.
Good idea.
Are we okay with this idea of a life estate? Now, let me ask you a question that you might see on a test, or at least build you up to a question you might see on a test. They like to ask you about inheritability. Generally speaking, if I own something, can my heirs inherit it from me? Can you think of a time? First of all, when would my heirs inherit stuff from me? When I die, right? Is there something I could potentially own that my heirs might not be able to inherit?
Yes.
What?
Something that might have a lien on it.
Say that again?
Real estate.
But what kind of real estate? If I own real estate, my heirs can inherit it. If I have, and for the most part, think about what we just talked about. Is there a type of ownership that might go away when I die? If I have what? If I have a life estate. Specifically, if I have what kind of a life estate? A conventional life estate. Because if I have a conventional life estate, when does my ownership end? When I die. Can my heirs inherit something that I cease to own the moment I die? So is a conventional life estate inheritable? No. How about a life estate pour ultra V? Yes, because in a life estate pour ultra V, my ownership continues after my death until who dies? The measuring life. So, conventional life estate, inheritable, yes or no? No. Life estate pour ultra V, inheritable, yes or no? Yes. As a matter of fact, the conventional life estate, it's the only freehold, what does that word mean? Ownership. It's the only freehold or ownership interest that's not inheritable. The conventional, you want to put that in your notes somewhere. Conventional life estate is the only ownership interest which is not inheritable. Life estate pour ultra V is inheritable. Fee simple absolute is inheritable. Everything else that we talk about as far as ownership is inheritable, except the conventional life estate. And the reason it's not inheritable is if Alicia owns this phone until Alicia dies, well, what happens to the phone as soon as Alicia dies? She doesn't own it anymore. How the heck can she leave it as an inheritance if it's not hers? Right? Does that make sense? It's not inheritable. We good with that? How do we feel about life estate? Ready to do one? Well, you'll probably never see one in your whole real estate career. Most likely. Most likely you'll never encounter one. I have never encountered one. No, I take that back. I've obviously encountered my grandfathers. I'm not talking about them. I have encountered one in the case of, this was years ago when I was doing property management, which I have not done in years and never will again if I can help myself. Tenants are the devil, y'all. I'm telling you. It's awful. I mean, they lie to you. You've never seen people lie so much when they don't have their rent. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I had one lady, her mama died 4 times in a 6-month time period. I mean, it was just like every time the rent was like, oh, my mom passed away. How many do you have? But years ago when I was doing residential property management, I had a gentleman who had a house over in Northridge. Y'all know where that is? If you go up Wake Forest Road where it turns into Falls of the Noose, there's a Northridge Golf Club up there. It's an old established Raleigh golf course community. Older homes on acre-ish lots, golf course lots in North Raleigh. People buy those houses and push them down. People pay $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 for that house and take a bulldozer to it. And then they build a $2 million house. That's what happens in that neighborhood. Well, he was renting his mother's house, and the house had been built in the late 60s, and it had not been touched since then. She was in a nursing home, and he was renting out the house. And I several times suggested to him that he would be better off to go ahead and sell the house because the house needed a ton of work to lease it out. It needed a new roof, it needed this. And I kept telling him, I said, Gary, you're going to tear this house down anyway. If you don't, the next person will, because you're wasting your money putting a $15,000 roof on this house because the person who buys it from you is literally going to push it down on day one. There is no hope of this house surviving. So why don't you just sell the house now? Because if you do rent it out, you have to put a roof on it because it's leaking right now. Why don't you just sell the house now? He couldn't. And the reason he couldn't was because he didn't own it. His mother had been granted a life estate in the property. He was the remainder interest in the life estate. So he was going to eventually own the property, but who owned it currently? His mom did. So I have encountered one in my entire real estate career. Does that make sense? All right, good, good. I don't know how y'all feel about that. I feel pretty good about it. Do we need to take like a 10-minute break after that and let your brains decompress for a second? All right, let's take a 10-minute break and then we'll come back and continue with these ownership interests.